So earlier, Rich, we talked about requirements of memory cards for video and then in general, but what about time lapse?
Yeah, I think time lapse is a little bit trickier because it really depends upon what you're doing. There's lots of factors I put out there. The first one being record time. You know, the thing you can't do in time lapse is touch the camera. As soon as you've touched the camera,
You've screwed it all up.
yeah, it's going to make, even if you're like, oh, I'm really careful and I'm popping this memory card, the slightest vibration or touch destroys the frame and you have a jump.
Even if it's in the middle of taking pictures, if you have a long interval, you're still possibly going to move that camera just a touch.
Yeah, so you have to make sure you have enough capacity to record for the duration you want to record. Now, some cameras have built-in intervalometers, which is the device that allows you to set the timer for how often it takes pictures. Many times the built-in ones will cap out at 1,000 pictures.
Right.
But you have other options to record a lot more with an external intervalometer. So you might be recording for days or weeks, and in that case, you could really need those big cards. So it's not uncommon to buy those 64 gig cards, and I think we're starting to see 128 gig cards too.
Yeah, they're getting there.
They're expensive, but a time-lapse shooter would likely buy that in order to support the record time. And one of the things people just have to think about is how long do they need to record. So I just think of it this way. Remember, if you're recording 24 stills, that's going to be about a second, or maybe you're doing 30. A lot of times with time-lapse, people will hold an individual frame and repeat it for a couple of counts. So you might only be shooting 10 frames per finished second, or 8 frames. But even still, you're going to go through a lot. The other big issue is going to really be how big those file sizes are, because this is not a 2 megapixel image.
Well, right, and that's one of the things that I always think about. I'm going out there, I'm like, okay, I'm used to shooting video, but all of a sudden I go from roughly 2 megapixels up to maybe 20 megapixels or 20 megapixels plus, so that file size is going to be a whole lot bigger. Also, it's going to depend, right, if I'm shooting JPEG on my camera or if I'm shooting RAW on the camera.
Yeah, and a lot of folks struggle with this. Obviously, the benefit with JPEG is it's ready to use, and it comes out at a nice small size, and you can fit a lot on the card. And that used to be the only way people shot time-lapse because cards were so low. You're like, oh, I got a 4 gig card, I'm shooting RAW. Oh, I got a 2-second time-lapse.
Right.
Kind of defeats the purpose.
Sure.
But what we're seeing now is with these larger cards, we can record longer. The benefit with RAW is that it gives you greater flexibility. So you can use a program like Adobe Camera Raw, open up the first image, recover the highlights, boost the shadows, put a little bit of vibrance in there, and then apply that to the whole sequence. And that works great. Or if you're dealing with tough situations like sunrise or sunset, you could develop it for the sunrise state and then develop it for the pre-dawn state and just cross-dissolve between those two streams.
Right.
So there's lots of ways of pulling this off. But JPEG, on the other hand, just gives you longer record times.
Right. So if you're want the best quality, obviously you might shoot RAW. If you're fine with the way it looks in camera, JPEG. But that's sort of determines our capacity, and you know how long you have to go out there, and you're determining the file size between JPEG and RAW. But what about speed, right? You might be in a situation with a time lapse that you could go with a pretty slow speed card, high capacity but slow speed, because you're firing off one shot, say, every 5 minutes or something like that. If you're doing a multi-day time lapse. But you might also be doing a time lapse where you're shooting off a frame every 10 seconds or 5 seconds or a second even.
Yeah, it totally depends on the style. Like if I'm doing long stuff where it's showing progress over time, like hours, it might be every 10 seconds. On the other hand, if I'm shooting people and doing time lapse and I want that energy of people flowing through the scene, I sometimes will shoot a 1 second exposure to get streaks at a 1 second interval. So it's just basically snapping open, close, right back open. And that's continuous raw data. And in that case,
if you're shooting RAW, yeah, and that's what I was going to say. If you're shooting that fast and you're shooting RAW, you're going to need a pretty fast card, right?
Yeah, and what you'll notice here is if you don't, the camera will lock up. So a lot of times people will just sit there on time lapse, not touching the camera, but just listen. And if if it's going for a few seconds where it's and then all of a sudden it's like
right. Something went wrong.
The interval changed.
I've had that experience actually. I went and earlier we talked about having organizing our memory cards. I actually had that problem a couple weeks ago. I went out and was doing time lapse. I was shooting RAW and I wasn't paying attention. I put a slower card in, and my camera, my 7D had it has a pretty big internal buffer.
Yeah.
But that internal buffer filled up and it couldn't clear it fast enough to write the card. And next thing you know, the whole camera locked up, and I had to start all over from scratch.
And sometimes it'll just slow down, and sometimes it'll totally lock up, and it'll fail, and then you have to restart the camera and go through your settings. So really, in that case, having a faster card comes in handy. I'll typically go 300x on up, although I have shot RAW time-lapse to 133x cards Typically, though, I can't do a faster interval than, say, a 5-second shot.
Right.
Now, another variable is how many slots does your camera have? A lot of the cameras that I use for time-lapse have 2 memory slots. And so I could set the one card up and then put a secondary card for rollover.
Okay.
So it'll go ahead and write to the second card once the first one's full. And that's great because that gives you the ability to shoot longer without having to, swap cards or start all over.
And rustle the camera a little bit. Yep.
Yeah. And so I think the final thing I would say is it really comes down back to your post workflow, the post-production side of things. And this is where JPEG versus RAW kicks in.
Yeah.
A lot of people want to use the JPEGs because they're really quick to edit together. You could fire open QuickTime Pro and say make a new image sequence and it'll slam them all together and it's great. And you could use basically free software to do this, and that's fine. The people who are really doing the high-end stuff are taking the time to shoot RAW, and then they're using tools like Aperture, Lightroom, or Photoshop to batch process those RAWs and spit them out, or even Adobe After Effects, which could pull RAW in. It really, though, is a huge leap in system performance. Like if I pull in a RAW image sequence into After Effects, I can't really do that on my laptop. I got to switch to a desktop computer, or I got to work at such a low quality, and then I hit render and I walk away for a while.
Right. The digital timeout, if you will.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think it works pretty well. I mean, do you want to just recap for the listeners?
Yeah, I think the few things to pay attention to are first determining how long you're going to be shooting for. That's going to determine the capacity of a card that you need. If you're going to be doing, say, an overnight shoot where you're going to be shooting for 12 hours, you're going to need a big card. The second thing that's going to sort of determine your capacity, but as well as your speed, as well if you're going to be shooting JPEG or RAW, right? Obviously, JPEG is going to be smaller file sizes and is not going to be as bandwidth intensive on the card. But if you're shooting RAW, that's going to affect the size of the card that you'll need, but also the bandwidth and the speed of that card that you'll need. And then the last thing there is more of your post workflow, right? If you're going to be shooting RAW, you're going to need a faster card, but also a faster computer when you're going to process that stuff.
Yep, so there you have it. If you're going to be a time-lapse shooter in addition to a DSLR shooter, make sure you pick up some of those faster cards because they'll really come in handy. The JPEG workflow is just fine if you're getting started out or you're shooting during daytime where you don't have a lot of lighting conditions changing. But if you're dealing with sunrise, sunset, or low light shooting, RAW is an absolute saver that just makes things look great.